Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special interview. Today we have a returning guest to the show, Brian Ochsner. Brian is a friend of Silver Doctors. Brian is also a high-producing wheat farmer, so he's got his finger on the pulse of the nation's food supply. And I got to tell you, right now, rightly so, it's all eyes on the election. Who's going to be declared the winner, and what does it mean for the future of the United States? But if there's not enough food to go around, then, we might have bigger problems on our hand than whether Team Red or Team Blue occupies the White House. So we're going to pick Brian's brain today, and we're going to find out what's really going on with the state of the nation's food supply. Brian, I'd like to thank you for joining us again on Silver Doctors.
Hey, Paul, glad to be here.
Now, Brian, it's great to talk to you because you're an optimist. And the last time we spoke, you were optimistic, and that really relieved me at the end of my interview because you were saying, as long as the trucks could keep moving, there'd be enough food to go around for the United States, and we get through this crisis just fine. So just to get a little bit of a status update, what is your impression of the state of the nation's food supply right now? Are the trucks still running? Do you still think that there's enough food to go around? And are we going to make it through this crisis okay when it comes to food, Brian?
I haven't seen anything that would really cause me to be more pessimistic about the supply and availability of food. I think this COVID stuff and the downturn in the economy has caused, end users like grocery stores, restaurants, not to order as much food as they have in the past. I don't think it's really the supply of food that's the problem. That'll be the challenge, but it could be affordability because we have seen some inflation here. Obviously, we've seen inflation with all the money printing going on with the government in the last few months and years. My concern isn't the. So even though wheat and corn harvests weren't as bountiful this year as they were last year, I still think we're okay as far as inventory and availability of food. Mm-hmm. The challenge might be the affordability for some folks. Mm-hmm. That's what my main concern is for right now. So that's my answer in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. So let's stick on that for a minute because I reached out to you a couple weeks ago and I said, we got to get you back on because, this was before the election just all of a sudden stopped and now we have this huge delay. But there's been a lot of articles and a lot of rightly so concern for the food supply and food price inflation and all of those things. And one of the things you had mentioned was the grain inflation canary, like the canary in the coal mine. So what were you trying to say with the grain inflation canary there? What is going on with that, Brian?
Okay. So as I look at global supplies and demand of grains for wheat, corn, and soybeans, the fundamentals are generally not bullish. They're okay. I mean, there's other countries over the last 5 to 10 years have learned to grow their own food. So like China, Russia, even Pakistan is learning to grow their own grains, and there's plenty of supplies there. And in America, American farmers are the most productive in the world, and we've still been, planting and harvesting large quantities of bushels of grain and corn. So given that, because the fundamentals aren't very bullish on the grains, that I call it. My theory is that when we start to see inflation in the grains, is the key indicator of when we're going to see higher, indicator of significantly higher inflation across the board in America. So that's my theory. And over the past 2 months, the grains have gone higher. They spiked higher. Wheat was about $4 a bushel back in the summer. And now for cash wheat at the elevator, it's over $5. Same with corn. It was down in the low to mid threes bushel. Now corn is over $4 a bushel. And soybeans have taken a good shot higher. So part of that is Chinese demand as well, because they had flooding over there, and they need to and they lost some crops over the past few months. They need to feed their people as well and make up for the difference of the bushels and acres they lost. But I think overall, and yeah, I can't say for sure because we don't know, because the markets are not, easily it's hard to know what moves markets nowadays. There's so much manipulation instead of true supply and demand fundamentals. But that's my theory, is that because of the increase in grain prices, that could be an indicator we are due to see higher inflation in America in the short to intermediate term future.
Now, as a stacker, as a silver bug at heart, and as a stacker, this is very interesting for gold and silver bugs, because I think what I'm hearing here is there's kind of like a difference between the futures market and the price at the elevator, if I heard you right. So could you just explain that for a minute? Because what I'm thinking is there's a COMEX price for gold and silver, right? And like right now I'm looking at the price for silver and I'm looking at $25.54. But if I want to buy an ounce of silver, I'm paying around $30 for that ounce of silver. So what is the dynamic there? How does that market function? What does it mean by the $4 price, but then the price at the elevator? Do we need to be concerned about that? Or what does that mean for the market in general there, Brian?
Okay, so for farmers today, and the two main grain markets in America are the Chicago and Kansas City boards of trade, and also Minneapolis, I think, has some grain markets as well. So for almost every farmer has a local elevator they go to, and that elevator bases their price on the futures price, whether it's in Kansas City, Chicago, or Minneapolis. And the difference between the futures price and the cash price is called the basis. And so I've also learned recently that the margins for these elevators for the grain prices are very, very thin. I mean, we're talking like, I think the average, or a story that reports that the average profit margin for grocery stores is about 2 to 3%. And that's pretty close to what the grain elevators run as well. So they depend on high volume and thin margins, and just depend on enough volume to go through to make the money. And that's why I wonder about the long term. I'm not sure the current system of farming and distribution and pricing is sustainable for the long term. Over the years we've had longer. This is kind of getting off the answer here a little bit, but it ties in. We've had a lot of farmers. You've had back when my dad, farmed in Western Kansas years ago, or so. When he grew up, there was a lot of small farmers around the area. But over the years, as the cost of operating got higher, you had to, like the old saying goes, go big or go home. Go bigger to stay in business. So you had a small number of larger farmers that just kept going and going and going. But I'm not sure that system of farming is sustainable over the long term. It takes a lot of time, energy, and resources to do it. And the margins, even with the higher prices recently in the grains, the profits really aren't that significant. You're not going to get rich farming. It's not you don't do it essentially for the money. So I think over time we'll need to see, and I think hopefully a larger number of smaller farms that can go directly to consumers instead of through these big elevators and corporate middlemen. And I think you're starting to see that with some companies, but it's going to take time to adjust. So it's a long answer there, but give your answer and made sense.
It does indeed, because it also. Well, I just heard an echo there, but that's okay. It does indeed, because it kind of makes me feel that there's a lot of hope that the gold and silver markets are going to like a cash and carry model, and it kind of sounds like it also could be developing that way when it comes to the grains too, which actually would be a good thing, because in my opinion, it's for producer hedging and whatnot is what the futures markets were originally designed as, but it's veered so far away from that with all of the overt manipulation we've seen. Now, Brian, I just want to talk about, kind of like the natural disasters that we've seen this year, because I can't remember what the name of it was called. It was called like the derecho or the Nino or something like that. But
the Dericho or Derecho, what they called it in Iowa, the big storms. Right.
Yes. And we all saw the pictures of like the grain elevators that were like toppled over by the wind and stuff. So I guess just with the natural disasters we had last year and with the natural disasters that we have this year, like, I don't know, is that affecting the crops that are still growing, or is that affecting the harvest that are in the grain elevators, or just what is your assessment in general about what is your assessment in general about the natural disasters and the impact that they've had on the food supply this year?
Yeah, and I think in some parts of Iowa that it definitely hurt it definitely took a lot of acres out of inventory, and that's probably input. And funny you call me a high producing wheat farmer, and in the years past we have, but this year for wheat and corn, our harvests weren't as good as in years past. Of course, last year was like a once in a lifetime yield. It was just we've never seen yields that good ever, just because of just everything hit just right. But now this year we had less moisture, growing conditions weren't quite as good, and the yields, it affected the yields. So yeah, I mean the weather definitely, as the Derico and drier conditions definitely hurt things as far as wheat and corn goes. I drive around quite a bit during the summer and spring, about several hundred miles in the Great Plains, and there was I saw very little good, what I call corn in good condition. Even dry land was pretty bad. Irrigated corn was a little better, but not by a whole lot. It still wasn't as bad as the 2012 drought. That was just scorched earth. That was just epic, and then just took a lot of if guys had a crop, they were lucky to get anything out of it. It was just one of those really ultra hot, dry years, like Great Depression kind of deal. But yeah, you're right. The Derico has affected things, supplies, and it's given a short-term bump on the floor under the price. But again, overall, I'm still kind of bearish on the overall fundamentals, because there's just so much inventory and so much supply of corn and wheat. I don't think we're I still think we're okay as far as like I said, we're okay as far as the amount, bushels of wheat and availability. It's just going to be the issue. I think will be with some folks. It could be the affordability.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That is indeed an issue. So let's stick on that for a second here, Brian. Because we're seeing a lot of changing dynamics right now. It's interesting. We moved across the country and a few years back, and we bought our house supposedly in an area that has a good school district. And you would think that with a good school district, there wouldn't be a lot of need or whatever. But, we got a letter from the school district saying, hey, the USDA is paying for school lunches for the rest of the year. So, school lunches are just going to be free starting Monday. And then I go to the USDA's website, and sure enough, it looks like they're picking up the tab for every single school kid in America. And that's a breakfast and lunch. So 10 meals a week. So that's one of the changing dynamics. Then another changing dynamic we've seen this year is a very increased demand and surge with charitable giving, right? Like the need to go to a food bank for food. There's another dynamic that's increasing here. And then the other dynamic is the plunge in restaurant sales, the plunge in restaurant patronizing. So I guess the question is like what do all these changing dynamics mean? Because these are not things that have been the norm. These are all new dynamics. So am I making any sense there at all? And how do you see that affecting food prices and the food supply in general?
Well, I think what the USDA did for the school lunches is in response to the declining economy because of the COVID government shutdowns. I think you have job losses, income losses, and one thing to remember about government policy when it comes to food, government, even back to the days of Roosevelt and the early 20th century. Government always has, will, and will continue to have a cheap food policy, because hungry people do desperate things and they revolt against their government sometimes too. So government doesn't want to do that. They understand. I think that's no matter if it's Democrat, Republican, who's in office, they want to keep people well fed. Even if the quality of food isn't good, that's what their goal is to do. As far as the restaurants go, here in Colorado, I live in Arapahoe County, which is just west of and south of Denver, or no, west and east of Denver. They're still at 50% capacity for bars and restaurants. So that's hurt the volume and sales for restaurants. And also with all these masks and plexiglass stuff, in some places the ambiance really it's killed the ambiance.
Yeah.
There's a little diner, little cafe. It's a great place. I mean, a great breakfast place, not too far from me. And even before COVID, they lowered their hours. They were open like usually 7 in the morning until 9 at night. Then they went from 7 to 2, just breakfast and lunch. And then when I went back after the restaurants opened back up, and I went in there, it was just like going into a lab. Everyone was masked and shielded up. You had plexiglass, and it's like, no, I don't like this.
Yeah.
And I was at a social event about a month or so ago, and a woman in her late 30s, early 40s, they have 2-3 kids, and she said, "Yeah, we're not doing the restaurant thing anymore. It just sucks, with everybody masked up, and they just don't want to do it." So I think basically because of it's obviously cheaper to eat at home. That's one factor, and number two, unless you're in a freer state like Florida, Georgia, Texas, it's not as enjoyable to go out anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the two reasons why you've seen less restaurant traffic, because of government edicts, but also because of economics, just simple economics. Some people don't even have the money to go out, or they're just pulling in the reins, pulling in their horns, so to speak, on extra money for food.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But either way, the food industry in general, as far as the logistics and the growing and getting it to where it needs to go, they'll be able to adapt to that as they've been doing. Whether it's haphazardly or whether it's going smoothly is debatable, but they're still able to adapt and function in that sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Because one of the things that I wanted to ask you is staying on this supply chain disruption theme for a minute, because there's been times where this year, like, we went months without being able to find any yeast, and we finally found some yeast about a month ago at Costco. I mean, we couldn't find yeast for months. Wow. You could find like the little packets, like the little teeny tiny packet of 3. But my wife's a professionally trained pastry chef, and we need more than just a little teeny tiny packet. Mm-hmm. But so there's been all these supply chain disruptions and the difficulty of finding just food in stock. Basically, I'm seeing half empty shelves when I go to the grocery store still to this day. But then we get conflicting reports saying the grocers are stocking up in preparation for like a potential second wave and increased demand from that. So just your thoughts in general. How are the grocery stores holding up with their ability to keep food in stock? Are they going to get wiped out in a matter of hours if some sort of new lockdowns come? Are people still going to be able to, go in and purchase the food that they need? Like what are you seeing when it comes to like the retail person going into the grocery store here in early November, Brian?
From my experience, I've seen some empty shelves occasionally, but nothing really that would be noticeable. Almost everything is pretty much stocked like normal. You have to remember that grocery stores run on a just-in-time inventory system. So I think the average inventory amount they have in place is like 3 days. That's what how often the trucks come to replenish it. So if there is a hit, a second lockdown, or God forbid, or whatever happens, there could be some problems with that. But I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I think it'll be okay. But again, with a year like this, you never know we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So I'd say I'd recommend maybe getting stocked up on a little bit extra food or supplies if you need to, but no need to go crazy for now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But that is optimism. That is good news to hear from you, from someone who actually has his finger on the pulse of the food supply. So that's actually good to hear there, in my opinion. Now, Brian, I want to talk just about what I would call just sort of like nationalism, or I don't even know what to call it really, but we heard reports early on about some countries, they were like limiting their exports. I think it was Vietnam. They were not going to export any rice this year. And we hear, like you had mentioned earlier, there was some flooding in China this year. So, like, is there any kind of developing, or do you see any kind of developing scenario where imports and exports of any given country, or even within the United States, could become affected? Or do you see problems there, or do you see just generally smooth functioning imports and exports when it comes to big ag in that sense? Or what are your thoughts there when it comes to this kind of like nationalism, as I would call it?
Great question. I think some, other countries are concerned about the future. That's why they're kind of making sure they have enough for their own people. Getting back to what I said about earlier about wanting enough, hungry people do bad things or desperate things against governments. So governments want to make sure they're fed and taken care of, so they aren't dependent on foreign countries for their food supply. I haven't followed it really. I haven't followed international news on this really that much, so I may not be the best person to talk about it. I know we have. I did read an article last night that we are scheduled to export more grains to China because of what happened over there. But with the Chinese, you never know. I mean, the Chinese have a history of saying, promising one thing and then backing out on the promise, just like the famous Phase 1 trade deal. Mm-hmm. I was listening to a video with Danielle DiMartino Booth, who used to work at the Federal Reserve, and she mentioned that in that Phase 1 trade deal that Trump signed, there was an escape clause that said if there was a act of God or pandemic, that they were obligated. China was obligated to hold up their end of the bargain. How convenient, right?
Yeah, that was in January too. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, long story short, a short answer. I think countries are just, looking at the instability around the world. They just want to make sure their people are fed. And in the short term, these, it could be bullish for American farmers. We could see more sales to China. But I wouldn't, wouldn't bet the house or the farm that the Chinese are they'll actually back, by the amount they promised. That's the answer.
And then I guess just to follow up on that, does the outcome of this election have any bearing on that one way or another? Like, do you envision that, if it's ultimately Biden that gets in, well, there's another escape clause for China as well, if my logic is making sense there. Did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
It could be. I don't know. I think if, God forbid, Sleepy Joe wins this, I think it won't be as good for American farmers. Trump has, with Trump, he's a interesting character, a flawed individual like we all are, but he has done, I think, at least give the appearance of going to the American farmer. And the subsidy payments, direct payments have helped out quite a bit. And that's what's kept some farmers going, frankly. I think the only difference I see is that although you don't want to depend on the government for subsidies, Trump will be more likely to fill in the gap if it's needed in 2021 or the future. And a Biden administration, I don't see being as farmer friendly as a Trump administration would be.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Very interesting. And just sticking on the government here for a second, Brian. One of the concerns of mine is just that, I just have this personal opinion that when the government does something, it costs more, right? It always costs twice as much. It takes twice as long. Mm-hmm. So, right. I'm looking around and I'm looking at the school lunch program, and I'm looking at, just the increased food demand in general from food banks. And I'm also thinking, there was also a time, I don't remember if this actually happened or not, but they were thinking about, in addition to EBT and food stamps and things like that, actually getting actual boxes of food to American households. So just my question to you is, do you see that much government involvement with the food supply? I see that as highly price inflationary. What are your thoughts with this? Just because it does seem that there's a lot more involvement in the government with food this year. What are your thoughts on that in general there, Brian?
It could be. I don't think I don't know if it'll cause that much food inflation at the retail level. I think the cost to fund these programs will continue to increase our debt and deficit. That's where it's gonna show up. So I think through it'll cost more money to fund these programs. And then, I don't know what we spent during COVID for like 5-6 trillion additional, money out of thin air. So I think that's going to show up in inflation and overall in the gold and silver prices and everything else eventually. I'm surprised it hasn't done it by now. One thing to remember as far as the prices of grains go, and then what the farmers cut of that, I think there was the Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau, or other organizations said that on average, so for every dollar you spend on retail at the grocery store, the farmer only gets 15 cents of that.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't think the increase, USDA programs, school programs will be inflationary, at the end user for most consumers. I just think the funding of these programs will just keep, just increase the debt and deficit. That's where it'll show up.
Because if I'm hearing you correctly, it almost sounds like they're kind of like cutting out the middleman a little bit there. Because if the government can do it smoothly and efficiently, then they're kind of cutting out the middleman. So you're eliminating the inflationary pressures, at least in the short term, that I was thinking there, if that made sense at all.
Yeah, it could be. I'm not sure exactly how those programs work. Or they might be getting these the food directly from these corporations like Kraft, Nabisco, at a discount, or I don't know the dynamics of that program, so I don't know. So I'm not sure exactly how that works.
Okay, and then Brian, wrapping it up here today, I always ask people what's on the radar. So aside from the election, because that's on everybody's radar right now, but just from a farmer point of view, from somebody who has his finger on the pulse of the nation's food supply, as we move into the end of the year, what are some of the things that are concerning you and some of the things that you're looking at here, Brian?
Okay. One thing that concerns, like I said before, I'm not concerned about necessarily the quantity of food. It comes back to the quality of food. Look over the years, you see more, a larger number of obese, overweight, and sick Americans. And I think that has a lot to do with the quality of food they eat. It's more processed foods, more fast foods, and I think that's one reason why I urge Americans to, look to go find local, farmers and ranchers close to you and buy direct from them. Cut out the middleman. You'll have a better chance of getting better quality food. That's better for you. And that's where you'll stay healthier. Because I think another thing that's going to coming down the pike is that there's a lot of things that are unsustainable in America today financially. Our spending and borrowing spending is unsustainable, and the traditional medical system is unsustainable too. These high prices for procedures and pills and surgery, everything else. The best thing for people can do is just stay healthy and make sure you never need prescriptions. So that's why I'm adamant. There's two reasons I'm adamant about people going direct to farmers. Number one, you get better quality food. That's better for you. And number two, it's better for the farmer as well. You get a better, cut out the middleman and get a better deal for him. And when Carl Denninger's talked about this a lot too. So when the modern medical system and Medicare is expected to go bankrupt, like in 2023, 2024, not too far away. The government won't be able to pay for surgeries or procedures, and people will have to go. Unfortunately, some folks might be out of luck when it comes to their health. I hate to say that. So I think you have to be more responsible for what you eat, what you put in your body, for your physical health and staying healthy. And also, there's something that happened this week that caused me to think about how you grow food and ag chemicals. I've never been really like a really environmentalist, on that side of it. I'm not a tree hugger, but over the years, I've seen the results, the effects of ag chemicals on the land and on people. A guy in my hometown, his name is mid-50s, he worked with chemicals a lot, passed away from leukemia. And I know him and another guy who were the two guys that worked with chemicals the most. And the other guy passed away from leukemia as well. Small sample size, but I think, I just don't think these ag chemicals are good for people or the environment or the food supply, and not the way God intended it for us to grow food. So that's something else to consider as well. And I think, everyone needs to be more self-reliant in when it comes to food, when it comes to nutrition and health. And I think given where we're at in our country, as far as the politics go, I'm reminded that phrase from Benjamin Franklin after they passed the Constitution back in the late 1700s. And a lady asks him, well, what kind of government do we have, sir? And he says, a republic, if you can keep it. And, I hope if Trump wins that we can, like I said, it's political triage. It's stopping the bleeding and keeping I call the socialists and communists at bay. But I don't know. I don't know what's really for the future of our country. I'd say you have to be flexible, know where look at the city, state, county you live in, what the government's like, what the people are like. And if it gets, I think I would not want to be around in inner cities or big cities. I think I just say it's the worst place you could live in the years to come. So I think you need to look at your surroundings, not depend on government to make things better. Depend on you and your family, the people around you, your community to make things better. It was kind of rambling, but this is we live in some very, very interesting times, to say the least. And I think you have to be kind of flexible as your approach to things, and to be kind of like a vigilant surfer. If you look at the waves, look at the horizon, see look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to you and your family. And again, it's kind of a rambling off the cuff stream of consciousness here, but that's what I see for America in the future. You have to be really, really challenge your assumptions. Make sure what you're assuming is factual and true. You cannot believe the media. For the love of God, shut your TV off and don't rely on even Fox News. I was just disappointed with their election night coverage. It was really, really pretty biased as well. So I think you have to just get rid of mainstream media, shut off your TV, do more critical thinking, go to channels like yours and others online, connect the dots, and come to your own conclusions. And that'll give you the best opportunity to survive and prosper in the months and years to come.
There you have it, folks. If we can keep this republic, it sounds like we're going to have enough food to get through this crisis. but the more important thing is the quality of the food and making sure that you're putting quality food inside your body. Brian, I'd like to thank you for joining us again on Silver Doctors.
Hey, Paul, thanks for the time. I appreciate it. Take care.